in half an hour lead somewhat more turbulent and turmoil lives than the Larkins. That's after today's Coast to Coast People.
Hello and welcome to Coast People, or perhaps I should say bienvenue and willkommen, because today, with 1993 just months away, we're going to do our bit for European unity. What do the British really make of it? And what do they make of our European neighbours? Well, bravely venturing across the channel from his home in Boulogne, we have Jean-Pierre Paulet, who's a consultant in the French fish industry. But he's lived in this country, indeed his mother's English, and he's worked in London, and he knows us Brits pretty well. Ronnie Payne is features editor of the European newspaper. He's been a correspondent for many years, 10 of them living in Paris. The European, you'll remember, was the brainchild of the infamous Robert Maxwell, and it survived 2 stormy years. It's now under new ownership, and it's still the only pan-European newspaper available all over the continent. Dave Hammock is a licensee and president of the Kent Federation of Licensed Victuallers. He's just come back from a fact-finding trip to northern France to find out how their licensing laws differ from ours. And joining us from London, the French radio journalist Estelle Lennemont, who's on duty even as we speak in case a big story breaks in London, and she has to dash off to tell her French listeners about it. She works for the national station Europe 1. In a moment, we'll find out what they all think, but first, let's find out what people in Kent think about the idea of European unity.
Well, I don't think we've got closer links with the French yet. I don't know if that will come later.
Would you like it to?
Yes, I mean, I think it's a good thing. I mean, we're supposed to be part of Europe. We have been for quite a long time, but I think it's bound to be bad if we remain isolated from the rest of Europe. So yes, I think it's a good thing.
Since the EC has come together and now so much closer, is your life changed? Is it different?
Probably more aware of Europe as a unit in itself, incorporating the UK. I don't think it's made any material changes that we're aware of.
I still can't get used to metres and centimetres and kilograms, but apart from that, no.
I don't think we've come across it. I mean, I don't think it's that evident yet, you know, that we've actually, it's all supposed to have happened in '92, but we're waiting for it to start.
I think maybe in the next couple of years, whether or not we get a single European currency or not, that may make a difference. But that's going to be so difficult to try and organise, and whether or not that's actually going to come about, I don't know, but that's the sort of thing that will impact us.
I don't think it has changed a lot. I think people in France are not aware of it. They're just, you know, they're still living in France and being French, and that's all, you know. They don't, I don't think they are really aware of that. Not at all.
Okay. Greater European integration now. Has it changed your life in any way?
Can't say it's changed ours at all.
Nowhere at all?
Nowhere at all.
You picked up anything from the French? I don't know, have you been over there more, or do you feel that the more you begin to know about them, the more you want to be like them?
I don't want to be like them, no, I'm very British. A lot of my friends find it easier to travel over to France. And I suppose when the tunnel happens, a lot of people use that, but I like to travel further afield, so no, I don't think the French have had any particular influence over me.
Estelle, let me come to you first in London. From what you heard there, do you think that that is a true representation of what we British think about Europe, and you French in particular?
Well, that certainly fits with what I get when I do interviews or vox pops, and I try to get people reacting to events in France. And usually there is a lot of... there is not a lot of knowledge of what's happening on what you call the continent. It's very interesting to see that you call it the continent, because of course we don't perceive it as such. We perceive it as different countries and being part of Europe. As you, well, you being on the other side of the channel see it as a unity, as a whole, which is certainly not the way we perceive it ourselves.
That's because we live in an island, of course. And you remember that Corsicans, who also live in an island, when they talk about France, they talk about it as le continent. There's no doubt about it. I think it's that's simply a geographical point. that it rises in the minds of people who live in islands. I mean, equally, the Americans talk about their continent. They talk about coast to coast on the continent. They mean the whole of their continent. That's because they're in one land mass. But when you incorporate islands, and we're going to incorporate quite a lot of islands into the European community, so I think we've got to get used to the idea of there being a continent and islands, though they're all part of the same thing.
So perhaps in a way we got there first by calling it a continent.
Maybe we invented it, who
Yes.
knows?
Now,
Us and the Corsicans, anyway.
Esther, can I ask you further, when you go to report for your listeners, and you work for a national radio station which is heard all over France, what impression do you give of us? Do you think that it's overall a favourable impression?
It certainly is, because I quite like Britain and I quite like the British. But I must admit that it's a bit of a... I follow the stereotypes to a certain extent, which is true also of the way my British colleagues cover France to a large extent. You have to start from what people know, and usually, for instance, they know about the royal family, and they have this very kind of idea of the British or the English as being eccentrics, and you can find a lot of things here that do go that way. So that's the kind of stories that I tend to report, the royals, and a lot of little things about society, and eccentricity is a bit part of what I do about Britain.
Jean-Pierre, you have a foot, if I can put it this way, on both sides of the channel, because
Yeah.
you're very familiar with both countries. You're perhaps better placed than anyone to say whether this impression that Esther has just mentioned is accurate.
Well, it is more or less. In fact, I was brought up with both nationalities, living in France, but watching, for example, English television in the evening. So, you know, that's really how I really learnt my English. I think the English are perceived in France, as she says, as Esther was saying, as eccentrics, that's for sure. And we sometimes have the proof of it. But little by little, I think, as we're going on into the common market, that impression is probably not so strong, I don't think.
We've just, the last edition of The European carried a big story about a poll. Your newspaper, Ronnie, carried a story about a poll which says that, depending on which people you believe, 44% or so of French now don't want Maastricht, and the idea of European Union seems to be going cold. What do you think of that, from your perspective?
Yeah, it's one of the fascinating events of the month of September, of course, that everyone's looking forward to, because there's no doubt in my mind the French are having a lot of fun with their poll, in the same way that the Danes did before them. It's turned into a very complicated poll, because it now looks, from the reports, there are all sorts of newspaper polls and magazine polls, but the one I always pin my faith on in France is that which is conducted by the RG, the Renseignement Généraux, which is a kind of police organisation reporting to the Ministry of the Interior, and they are usually very accurate indeed. They are now talking about a strict 50-50 ratio, and the reason, I think, is has very little to do with what people in France think about Europe or the common market or the AQ or the EMU or any of these rather tiresome cliches that have entered into the language. What they're saying is, are we going to put up with President Mitterrand for any longer? They are saying, is this not a wonderful chance for us to express something which we're not asked to express an opinion upon, namely whether we want Monsieur Mitterrand as president? So
exactly.
that it deforms
That is true.
all the calculations and makes it very difficult to assess from that, really, whether they're in favour of Europe, as we call it, or not.
You've mentioned some of these buzzwords that we've had forced down our throats in the last few months. Now, someone perhaps who hears a bit about what the ordinary man thinks about those is Dave. You get people come into your pub. What do they talk about? What do they make of Europe? Do they see any relevance in it all?
Well, one of the things that came across looking at the Vox Pops you showed earlier, and it comes across my bar, is surprising the amount of ignorance about Europe, the European market and the whole setup. Most people that you interviewed there said it hadn't affected them. But it has. It's affected everybody in this country, one way or another, whether they realise it or not. All the various orders and instructions that have come down from, you know, the Brussels bureaucracy that we now have, the unelected bureaucracy, we'll add that in as well. It has affected people's lives. I'm amazed that they haven't realised it.
Do you detect any hostility towards the way it's affected their lives?
Not really as I've detected a great deal of apathy, but no, not necessarily hostility.
You and your fellow publicans did something about trying to unseat that apathy, didn't you? Because I know you, last week, and I know because I went with you, you went on a trip to the Nord-Pas-de-Calais area of France to find out a bit... Well, you tell me, what was the main aim of the expedition?
The main aim of the expedition initially, I've got to say that because you were with us and you realised that it went totally in the other direction. The main idea was to have a look at their working practices, the whole setup of their laws relating to the sale of liquor, etc., and ours, and comparing the two and see if we can marry them together. Perhaps pick the best from the continent, ally them to the best of ours, whatever. In the event, it turned out, as you well know, into possibly because the MP came with us, it turned into a string of civic receptions.
Yes, well, let's just remind ourselves, if we can now, by having a little look at the report of what happened when that party of publicans went across to France for the day. They came with a long list of questions, and after a few drinks, they were ready to ask them. But it wasn't going to be easy.
It's sort of a tax on profit, but it's not quite a tax on profit.
There was so much to say, and all at the same time.
Say something, David.
These are members of the Kent Federation of Licensed Victuallers, and they've come to France with one simple aim.
Just to see what the working differences are, what their working practices are, how they differ from ours, and how perhaps we can get them to work in harmony.
But it soon becomes clear that their charming hosts have planned for them an itinerary which takes in rather a lot of civic receptions and speeches and not quite enough cafe bars. But through the window of the town hall, they glimpse a research centre.
We can't do this, we can't
You try and
put
put chairs on the pavement in England, you've got to go to the council, you've got to go to this.
Permission.
Standard of hygiene in there, like small kitchen there, compared to what we've got to come up to, is ridiculous. It's filthy.
VAT, business rates, drink driving, so much they want to investigate. The French bar owners, quite used to British visitors, find some of our attitudes very strange. These people can't understand why we bar children. Oh no, if you don't like children, you don't like people, she says. That's terrible. The landlord's never been to an English pub. He's too busy serving English people. Time for another coach ride to another civic reception and some more speeches. Their hosts may not be clear what they wanted to know, but they're glad they came. It's the first time that a federation from across the channel has bothered to get in touch and find out about our problems. That's really interesting. A glass of bubbly, and the visitors are ready to say what they think.
The licensing laws are somewhat different here, but what we must do is to see the best of them and the best of ours and marry them together.
But what about children in pubs?
Well, I personally would like it to be allowed at the discretion of the licensee.
We finished up really being tourists in the end, haven't we? It's been very enjoyable, but it's been very long, very long.
I think our laws suit us better, far better, for the type of trade we have.
They parted, agreeing that this was just the start, already laying plans for their new friends to come and try a nice warm pint of Kentish ale. It struck me, being part of that trip, and not drinking, I have to add quickly, that there were two basic differences. One was in the way that they had seen the reception. They thought that you were coming over there on a sort of, well, just to go and see the places and meet some of the people. For one thing. For another thing, it was just the attitude towards the whole thing of entertaining and of having people around. It was far more formalised over there and less formal in our country, perhaps. What did you really get out of it in the end, do you think?
Some good relationships were forged. In terms of the questions that we wanted to ask about legislation, etc., we never got to any of that, as you saw. 8 people trying to talk through interpreters was pretty much fun. In the event, 3 of us going back on the 25th of this month and meeting some on a personalised basis to try and get some of the questions that we wanted to ask sorted out. But yes, it was not what we expected, and it just turned into one big...
But regard it as a beginning rather than as an end.
Yes, definitely.
Do you find it surprising, Ronnie, that as you just heard Monsieur Desplanques say there, that was the first time that any group in Kent, of hoteliers or anyone involved in that trade, had been to ask them about their problems? Here we are, a few months away from European unity, allegedly. Where's the unity?
I thought, incidentally, I thought that compared very favourably, that kind of meeting compared very favourably with some of the greater international gatherings I've been to. Actually, it was a great deal more friendly than some of the summits that have taken place around Europe.
Oh, it was very friendly, wasn't it, Dave?
It was on a nice sort of personal basis. Yeah, I suppose it is, actually, that it is odd that people are reluctant to leave their own territory and move out into somebody else's. But I don't know, it doesn't strike me as odd, really, because I think these social habits are embedded in people. I've no doubt that there are people, well, I know for a fact that there are people who live in the Massif Central in the centre of France who've never been to Paris, actually, who've certainly never been to Marseille, indeed, because people don't necessarily feel that they have to move around. And it was always, in the old days, it was a bit of an expedition for people from that area of France. They did, in fact, go to Paris, but they went to settle there. They went there almost as foreigners in their own country, and they set out. I mention the Massif Central because that is the traditional area from which come the cafe proprietors and the restaurateurs in Paris, and rather like everybody in London, all dairymen in London used to be Welsh, so all restaurateurs used to come from that area of France. So no, people are accustomed to their own ways, and however much you join in the larger unit, there is, actually, I have to let rip with it at this moment, actually, there is a dreadful EC community word which we are all familiar with, or some of us are over familiar with, subsidiarity. This is what we're talking about here, is subsidiarity, which is a particularly horrible word, and what it means is that people should be left to get on with their own affairs at local level, and that the larger body, the wider body, should only be brought in to deal with big questions. And I think that's about right.
Are we working towards the situation, perhaps this is a question for our sort of token French contingent, if I can put it that way today, where that will be the nature of the European unity, that there won't be any interference, and if we want to carry on calling our ice cream, then we can do that, etc., etc., but that the real benefit will be just in having a big trading bloc where people can trade freely and forget about the social dimension, and which is going to mean a lot more to people perhaps in Dave's pub. What do you think, Estée?
Well, I think that's probably the British view of what Europe should be, but it certainly isn't the French view, and to a large extent isn't the German view, because the German and the French want political unity, political union. And the real debate in France now is this political union, which was the aim and has been the aim of the French government and the successive French government, whether they be right or left-wing. They always wanted the same thing, a kind of closer connection, political union with Germany in particular. And now the question and the big debate, I agree with Ronnie Payne that there is a lot of domestic issues in the French debate on Europe, but there are also some major issues. Kind of people woke up all of a sudden and started thinking, do we really want to lose our sovereignty? So I think that when you talk about kind of general free market, European free market, that's the English view of it. It certainly isn't or hasn't been until now the French view.
Do you think then that we are too, as a nation, egocentric when it comes to Europe, regarding anything that's not England as somehow foreign and therefore to be avoided?
Well, I certainly think that that's a view that every country has, and there's nothing specifically British about being self-centered. Every country is self-centered. It's just that the cultural, the history and the culture are different. So you are much more, I don't know if the word is right or wrong, but much more capitalist in a traditional way, while the French are much more used to having state intervention. So they have a different view of the way society should be run.
What do you think about that, Jean-Pierre? Would you agree with that?
Well, I agree with that, yes.
We've just seen examples within the last month of the French attitude to authority and the way things are run. They see things very differently, don't they? I mean, I hesitate to say this, but I suspect that lorry drivers would not have got away with blocking motorways as the French did.
No,
I think they would have been moved long before.
No, we've had the same problem. I think I remember calling you once concerning the blockage of the Boulogne harbour.
Indeed.
And in fact, there the police did not intervene whatsoever, and just waited until the authorities promised that these seamen would get what they wanted, or partly of what they wanted. That is to be heard by the government and be listened by the government, then they lifted the blockade. It's the same thing with the drivers, you know, really. The police intervened at one time, at the wrong time, in fact, when things were sort of getting good. I think in England, definitely, many people I've spoken to at the time who were, you know, I was dealing with in England, were telling me that the police would a long time have intervened and the roads would have been free.
Perhaps we've got a, dare I say it, San Ferrian attitude. Ronnie, what do you think? I know
Well,
you...
it's one of the things I admire most about the French, as a matter of fact, is their fine rebellious spirit. Actually, they will not take to rules light. They will not boringly accept every silly rule that's imposed upon them. They are used to behaving as though the central government, and this goes back, I'm not talking about wartime things, this goes back for several centuries. They're accustomed to the idea that the orders from Paris are those of a hostile government, and therefore you are perfectly entitled to do anything within your power. Absolutely, that's right.
A nod of assent from both.
Very healthy it is too. I wish we could import some of that feeling here.
But surely, tunnel or not, that is an attitude which is, perhaps in this case, we're talking about France particularly, that is a French attitude. Ours, as you say, is different. You can't legislate people into all thinking the same way about that kind of thing. So perhaps, this is perhaps a, I'll put this to you, is the idea of European Union, United States of Europe, etc., dead in the water?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I myself am in favour of it in a fairly strong way. Yeah, I don't want us all to start being alike, because that'd be an awful pity. It's much nicer if we keep our diversity of views and attitudes, but that doesn't mean that we can't band together and arrange our national lives on an international scale. That seems to me a good idea, provided we keep down at the bottom of the pile our characteristics, some of which are lovable and some of which are hateful, actually, and that goes for every country within the community. I know most of the almost all the countries of Europe, and the same is true in every one, that everybody has their own little ways, and you can't conceivably, and nor would there be any point in trying to legislate to make everybody alike. You might as well just say that every marriage should be alike. It's not...
How then are you going to get around the problem that people in Tenterden, to pick an area of Kent, don't care, don't know what's going on in Arras, to pick an area of France? They're always going to be apart, aren't they?
Apart of what?
Apart from each other?
Apart, yes. Yes, yes, of course they are. But I hope that the more that becomes known, the more television programs there are of this kind which discuss these things, the more there are newspapers like The European, which is taking a European attitude in these things. I think a time will come when, even in darkest Tenterden, people will know a bit more about what is happening in Paris, Bonn, Rome, and such like places. I think that after all, the communications are readily available. And,
yes. They'll have to be made to care before they'll know, won't they?
Well, not made to care. I think
just the interest. I would think.
Try to raise their interest. I think it's our job,
Curiosity.
it's your job, and it's my job to entertain people and to inform them at the same time. And maybe we're not very good at that, because it's a reproach to us that there are people around who don't know in Kent what's happening over in Boulogne, for example.
Not. And there are people even in the mining area of... I worked for a time in the mining area near Cambrai and Dour in that region, and there are people there who are a certain age, I must say, not amongst the young generation, but who have not travelled at all. Some of them haven't even seen the sea. Can you imagine nowadays that you can take your car and drive down? It takes, what, an hour and a half from that area down to Le Touquet or Boulogne or Wimereux to see the sea, but these people have never seen and probably will maybe get the interest, but you've got to... This is the thing, to wake up their interest and their curiosity for them to come over.
It's a bit of an uphill struggle, I imagine.
But no, but with the tunnel, most of the people live in Kent can just take their car, go over for a weekend, even for the day, and spend some time in the Côte d'Opale, which is a lovely coastline. The people there are very friendly, and you've got plenty of hotels, everything, and little guest houses, and you can mix with the French people, like a lot of the French people
fostering
do.
the contacts is
come
what it's all
over,
about.
you know.
And that's what you went to France for the other day.
Jean-Pierre's just put forward a lovely plug for Northern France. That's exactly why we went to France, to try and encourage some of you over this way.
Exactly.
But one of the things I would hate to see, if you look along this settee now, if the public that are actually viewing this had to say, who is the continental man on this settee, I can look at the way Jean-Pierre is dressed. He actually typifies the continental person. And that is super. And we shouldn't try to move to some kind of state where we're all going to dress alike or be alike. Yes, vive la différence. It's information that will make us aware of France and the other European countries, and the same goes for us here.
Of course.
We don't want to be moulded into one big blob.
So it's a matter of vive la différence, isn't it?
What do you want
and
me
that,
to say?
I'm afraid, is
Shall
where
I
we're going to have
say
to
that
leave it.
everything
I
is
hope
very
we've done our little
interesting?
bit towards contributing to the great debate. Coast to Coast People will be back next week.